Today's episode is sponsored by Rev, the productivity powerhouse for content creators, journalists, market researchers, and more. Capture audio from anywhere, get AI-powered summaries and quotes, and leave security worries behind with Rev. Whether you're on the go or in the office, Rev's got you covered. Discover more at rev.com. Hi, I'm Kendall Kelton, and I'm your host today on The Rough Draft. Featuring honest conversations with folks from across the creative industry, The Rough Draft explores the creative process, tools, and resources used by some of the best in the business. From journalists to content creators and business leaders, we shed light on what it looks like to break into the industry, make mistakes, collaborate with others, and the essential tools that help us all along the way. This week, I'm super excited to be talking with Jamilah King. Jamilah is an editorial director at Mother Jones and oversees a team of investigative reporters covering race, politics, criminal justice, and more. She previously worked as a managing editor at Buzzfeed, and as a reporter, she's profiled Kamala Harris, Stacey Abrams, and Lucy McBath. Her work has also appeared on HBO, Showtime, and CNN. And on today's episode, Jamilah is going to tell us about her career and approach to storytelling as both a journalist and editor, including her extensive coverage of Kamala Harris over the years. All right. Hi, Jamilah.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It is such a great opportunity to be here. I used Rev a lot.
Oh, yeah.
In the beginning of my career.
Oh, my gosh. Love to hear that. But I'm excited to get to know a bit about you, and I know our audience will as well. So I want to start from the beginning. What sparked your interest in journalism?
Wow. So my interest in journalism began when I was quite young. I was in middle school. It was March of 1997. At the time, Stanford had this really incredible basketball team that was in their third straight Final Four, and they were led by a point guard named Jamilah Wideman. And I was like, I like her name, and also I like basketball. But that month, she was on the cover of Sports Illustrated, and she was the subject of a feature by Gary Smith that was just written in such a compelling way. It was a pretty, dark history of her family and sort of how she overcame that. I think that was the moment where I was like, oh, wow, you can write really pointed history in a way that really resonates with people. That said, I don't think I really made the connection until years later because I didn't really pursue journalism. The one message that I got growing up from my mom was do something you love. And so that gave me a lot of freedom in thinking about what I wanted to do, but I couldn't figure out for the life of me what that was until I was in my early 20s.
And so what was like that like spark that was like, okay, I'm going to do this now. Where did you go first?
I went to Craigslist. That's where folks went back in the day.
That's true.
So I was finishing up college, and because all I knew was school, I was like, well, obviously more school, right? But I was like, let me try this journalism thing before I make any like real decisions. And so I found my first journalism internship at a place called Wiretap Magazine, which no longer exists. And it just so happens it was just like a very small operation run by a wonderful woman named Christina Rizga, who really kind of just needed an assistant. Okay. And so we were working out of her house in San Francisco. And I loved it. I loved the fact that you get to read and write and get paid. That's really cool. So that's kind of when it clicked for me was in the early 2000s. And that was also a moment where, we were in this transitional moment in journalism where things were finally becoming digital. Yeah. Blogs were a big thing. And so there was possibility because I like I said, I didn't go to journalism school. I didn't see myself as a traditional journalist, right? But I did read a lot, and I was really into music. I was really into culture. I was really into culture writing, and I've been hooked ever since.
And then you transitioned to New York City.
Yeah, I moved to New York City when I was 26 years old. And it was, it was all the things, right? It just so happened it was 2011. So this was right around the time when, social media was really taking off and there was suddenly a lot of opportunity in journalism. And so that's where I got to sort of be in the belly of the beast, so to speak, and just write and practice my craft.
And then you transitioned to much larger publications, right?
Yes.
And so
Yes.
you were at Mike and your first stint at Mother Jones and Buzzfeed. So how did that transition go from being you were in this like cultural local kind of gig for a while to then being exposed on a much larger platform?
Yeah. It was not planned. you know, I think the entire time I was like, well, I'm still going to go to grad school. But I think that, that moment in journalism was really interesting because there was just so much opportunity, especially in New York City.
Yeah.
And so I remember going to Mike.com's office for the first time. It was in the West Village, and it was this big open concept office with it was just fun. It was all the typical things you hear about startups. There was a bevy machine. There was free snacks. There was just a lot. There was this huge influx of capital into media, which I hadn't experienced before because my history was at smaller nonprofit or, alt weekly publications. I was very skeptical of it, but also I saw the opportunity that it gave people. So, at Mike, I was able to meet some of the smartest people I know. And I was able to see kind of what happens when you just give a bunch of people money to create, and that was really cool.
You were saying how Mike, as an example, was getting this stream of cash coming in, but then you see media outlets shutting down. And you know that personally. So how has navigating that shift kind of influenced the way you approach journalism now?
I think the thing that always kept me from thinking about journalism as a long-term career was the fact that I was raised working class, and I was raised in like a blue collar family where folks had pensions and they stayed at jobs for 20 and 30 years. And I didn't see that in journalism. I especially don't see it now. So for myself, I've had to really become comfortable with the instability of the industry. You never get totally comfortable with it, obviously. The sort of guiding force for me has been asking myself one question, which is, how can I make myself useful? So much of journalism is driven by ego. And, it's like my byline, it's my sort of clips, it's my body of work. And that's important. But I think there's also a moment where, particularly if you're a woman in journalism and you're thinking about starting a family or whatever, you have to think about like what you're actually willing to do. And for me, that's meant, having to think about, well, do I want to be that reporter who's out in the field all the time, filing stories and building up that body of work, but also are there other things? Are there other places in the newsroom where I can be useful? Whether that's mentoring other folks, whether that's editing, whether that's, just finding places to fill the holes, right? Because like you said, places are shutting down. So there's plenty of work to go around, and not a lot of opportunity. So if you do find yourself with the opportunity to be in a newsroom, the question really is like, how can you make yourself useful, and how can you kind of fight against that feeling of being stuck or feeling stuck, right? And feeling like you're giving into the cynicism, you're giving into like, that is kind of how the machinery is designed to work right now, right? And so figuring out how to be flexible, figuring out how to adapt, figuring out how to look at changes in the industry not as threats but as opportunities is really hard, and it takes some time, but that's been something that's been important to me.
Mother Jones in particular is a nonprofit, which may come with its own kind of unique set of challenges. Y'all aren't necessarily throwing up a paywall to get to some of y'all's like investigative pieces. And so how does that differ from some of these like larger commercial outlets, like advantages or hurdles?
Yeah. So at Mother Jones, we're a nonprofit, which means we do not rely solely on advertising to make revenue. And it also means that we have to be really selective in the types of stories that we pursue. We're not going to send 10 reporters to cover a presidential, debate necessarily. But what it does mean is that we have to be really selective in figuring out, okay, so what is our unique angle here? What are our hardcore readers interested in? I think you have to be a little bit more scrappy.
Do you think in the scrappy nature, being able to pour yourself into more diverse content was part of the decision to come back? Because you had left for an opportunity, and then a
Yeah,
year ago, just about
yeah,
almost exactly a year ago, you came back. Yeah.
almost exactly a year ago. Yeah, absolutely. The thing that has always impressed me about Mother Jones is the longevity of the masthead and the folks who are in the office. And so I knew that at Mother Jones, I could really work on building a career, right? Like kind of really, and I'd made this decision a few years ago to focus on editing and try to understand what that even means. Um, and I knew that I'd have the flexibility and also the time to sort of figure out what that meant and make mistakes and be able to sort of recover from that, hopefully. So that was a big draw in coming back. And also there were some really exciting things sort of bubbling up at Mother Jones that I knew I wanted to be a part of.
I want to kind of talk about your storytelling. And you in particular have reported on such sensitive and nuanced issues. And I want to kind of understand a bit more about your process for ensuring your stories. Yes, they're investigative, but they're also deeply human. And so I want to just get a peek behind the curtain a bit about how you approach your work. You've done, long form content, you've done podcasts. Is there a particular channel that you are called to kind of push your stories and your work forward?
I think I would have said 5 years ago it was writing, but I'm pretty platform agnostic these days. I think that as consumers, we are so inundated with storytelling that, and it comes at us from all different angles, and I think we have to kind of adopt that attitude as producers and editors and reporters. I will say that I've really loved audio. Learning more about audio. I've been a big fan of podcasts for years. Really appreciate the intimacy of that platform. And also, there's some nuances in that, right? Like I think there's some nuances in terms of how, as a reporter, you approach those stories. What makes good tape for audio is not necessarily going to work in a written piece. Ideally, all of these platforms work together, right? Like I think at Mother Jones right now, we're trying to figure out a way to make individual stories work on a bunch of different platforms.
Yeah, and people are just absorbing content in different ways. Like they could have once been a voracious reader. They have a busy life now. They have to catch something really quick. It's a newsletter, or maybe it's a podcast on their commute to work. And I have to imagine like having to think about all the different ways you have to put one single story out there in the world. You find a lot of creative joy in walking that, if I read that correctly.
Sure do.
So
Sure do.
are there things that you constantly go to like refill your creative cup, or just to get like your writing
Yeah.
or thought process or editing kind of going?
Yeah, I'm a big walker. I've always been a big walker. I've loved taking super long walks. I'm lucky to have lived in really walkable cities. And so for me, whether it's walking my dog or just taking long walks by myself, and recently it's been running, but doing those things without distraction, so without headphones, which is it's a really different thing. I've always been really, really inspired, particularly by runners who are able to run without any headphones, without any distractions, because I think that is the hardest thing in the world to do. Um, and so, but it is a really interesting practice in figuring out how to tune in to your breathing and also surprise yourself with what things come up, right? I realized that, as I run or even if I'm walking, I'm usually daydreaming and it's aspirational. If I'm aspirational, I can dream and think of all these cool things I want to do. If I'm present, I'm like working through an issue or a particular problem, or maybe ruminating and going over something again and again, but like also just trying to sit with what's present. So for me, movement is really important. And, just also finding joy, man. I tend to think I'm really an optimist. And so trying to find the things that I connect with other people on, I think is really important, and figuring out what you can learn from those connections.
You were talking about connection. There's some people who are, collaboration is fun in some instances and not in others. And I think when you're an editor in particular, collaboration has to be so essential to the relationships with your staff. So I'd love to kind of understand how you approach that in journalism, what your take is on it.
So for me, I've always been really lucky in that every editor I've worked with has been collaborative in nature, in spirit, and practice. There's definitely, sort of a confrontational approach to editing, which I don't really subscribe to. I don't find it useful or effective for me.
Yeah. And that's what you also see in movies. Like the editor is always like this like badass, but who's like not going to take anything and not going to take any like questions.
Totally. I think the portrayal of reporters and editors in movies is of these two incredibly strong, aggressive personalities coming at each other at 100 miles per hour and colliding, and the most powerful winning. And while I think that might be true in some ways, most journalists are like nerdy little introverts who, are grateful to have somebody else to kind of bounce ideas off of. And so for me, the process of journalism has always been deeply collaborative, because it has always been, I write this thing, it kind of makes sense. Usually it doesn't. So I have an editor who helps me get it into shape. I have a copy editor who makes sure that everything is like, tidy. I have a fact checker, if I'm lucky, who's able to go through and tell me what I've gotten wrong. I have even a web editor who's able to stage a story. Like I have all of these people who I'm relying on to make the story happen. And I'm really aware of that. I'm definitely aware of it as an editor who's been in charge of kind of pulling all these pieces together and getting them out into the world. And I think the thing that we miss in this moment of, influencers and creators who are kind of tasked with doing things completely on their own is that they don't have that sort of backup, that whether it's an institution, whether it's an editor, whether, it's not just for the sake of being able to say, hey, I have a team. It's, to help offload some of the work. And that collaboration means that you have more opportunities for people to catch things. You have more opportunities for people to help make things better. And so the onus isn't completely on you.
So you mentioned fact checking, and I'm interested because the amount of information coming out these days and the risk of misinformation is pretty high. And AI is a thing that people use for, we'll say, good or evil at this point. How do you see the utilization of AI becoming more prevalent in newsrooms? But how do you see like this misinformation impacting reporting at Mother Jones or elsewhere?
Yeah, I'll start with the second half of that question. So I think we just saw it this week with Hurricane Milton. You saw so much misinformation flooding around the internet. And I think it's difficult to figure out how to have that conversation with folks, because on the one hand, it ultimately becomes a conversation about privilege, right? Like who has access to information that is vetted, that is fact checked. That is sort of the environment that we live in when you're looking at all these storied institutions that have their reporting behind a paywall. The free content that we have access to is usually questionable, right? But also the bar to entry is lower. And so it is easier to sort of be someone who has traditionally been locked out of the industry and say, you know what, I'm going to start my own thing and it's going to be a great thing. But then you have platforms that incentivize, creating constantly. And so it's just this wild beast that just keeps growing and growing and growing. I think that, there definitely needs to be more of a conversation around media literacy that's not centered on shame or on, um, judgment, because I think people tend to do the best they can with what they've got and what's interesting to them, right? In terms of AI, like definitely when AI first became a really big thing in 2023 for me, I was like, what the fuck is this? Like, we're all doomed, right? And then I was able to sort of walk that back a little bit. I was lucky to go to the Maynard Institute training, which is an annual training in Texas. And I was able to meet a professor at Boston University, Michelle Johnson, who has a really great newsletter that sadly is on hiatus, but it's called AI Insider. And it was just really helpful for me because she basically would just explain what was happening, but also how you could use these things as reporters, right? So how can you make something like ChatGPT or Copilot or Gemini useful for you? How do you take a data set, for instance, and throw it in there and make your work as a reporter more feasible? And so that really helped shift my perspective and say, okay, like this is useful as a tool, and like every tool, it's going to be scary in the beginning, just like the internet was scary in the beginning. But now we see it more as a tool. So really, it's just my facility with that tool.
So let's talk a bit about tools. Are there any like tools that you're like, these are the things that every reporter should use today? Or like if somebody were entering their career, like this is a thing that even if you have $3 to your name, you should invest in?
Yeah. So a couple things. I think a YouTube premium subscription is key, just because you get access, you don't have to deal with ads and all that. There's also an app called TickTick, which is a task app that I am trying to learn how to use. But the way that I have learned how to use it is really helpful, in that it helps you sort of collate your tasks based on different buckets, but also the immediacy. I would also recommend Canva, honestly. I think not even just like making stuff look cool, but just having the confidence or having the sort of visual mindset when you are making anything from a resume to, a syllabus to, a story, whatever it is.
Well, thank you for sharing a bit more about like your process. And I think we're all going to maybe walk out of here trying to avoid using their headphones on their next walk or run. I don't know to what success, but we'll try.
It's really hard.
Yeah. Jamilah, you and Kamala Harris are both from the Bay Area.
Yes, we are.
And how do you think growing up in that particular cultural and political environment has shaped your understanding of her political rise? I mean, you have been reporting on her for years now.
I think growing up in the Bay Area has allowed me to understand not just Kamala Harris and how she approached politics, but sort of how diverse a particular like party or segment of politics can be, right? So I think on the national level, especially in national elections, we're used to thinking about Democrats and Republicans, right? In the Bay Area, which is a fairly progressive place, but there is a lot of gradation in there, and there's a lot of conservative values, conservative pockets, right? So if anything, it's allowed me to I think approach looking at her in a pretty nuanced way, because I think the Bay Area is a really beautiful, full, diverse, but very nuanced place. And she grew up in Oakland. I grew up in San Francisco. We're about 2 decades apart in age, but I think still like the residue of so many of the political movements that the Bay Area is known for was very much present in my childhood as it was with hers. So I'm talking about the Black Panther Party. I'm talking about, gay liberation struggles. I'm talking about sort of, 1960s, 1970s anti-war protests and movements. And so all of that stuff was really palpable. And for me, for instance, like some of the most um, tangible ways that showed up for me was not, at my dining room table. It was, I grew up in San Francisco, really close to the Haight-Ashbury. And so there were a lot of sort of aging hippies around, like folks who come to San Francisco to protest the war and then gotten involved and then gotten pretty deep into drugs and were like, by my childhood, like the folks who were like kind of the eccentric people in the neighborhood sleeping on the streets and whatever, right? And so I say that because it's, there's like an idealism that is also kind of tragic, right? Like you see kind of all shades of it. And I think that has shaped a lot of my perspective of covering her rise, and I think my approach to politics in general.
What were some of the earlier stories or maybe even just characteristics you noticed about her that may have been overlooked by broader media until maybe her presidential bid?
Let's see. Some of the older stories, I think, had to do with how Kamala Harris was able to build or not build coalitions wherever she was. I think she was always this sort of newcomer who was a little bit different. And the sort of ruptures that caused, I think, are probably more telling of her than the history that it's made, right? So I think you'll notice now, and this year, she's not talking a lot externally about the historic nature of her running again for president, or what it would mean for her as a woman, as a Black woman, as a biracial person to be a president. And I think that's part of it. But like, I think in order to even get through the political, gatekeepers of San Francisco, she had to be really, really ruthless. That's the sort of through line that I've seen with her, is just this very calculated approach to everything. And sometimes that's been, not in her favor. It's made her seem excessively cautious. But also, it kind of shows that she's someone who is not just running on like good vibes and luck, right? Like she's had some skin in the game, and she's been beaten up quite a bit. So that's something I've noticed for sure.
Yeah, and I think especially when she was kind of thrust into the national spotlight, when she was in the Senate and all of these hearings that she was participating in, people started to really see kind of like that more ruthless, calculated kind of side of her. And we're like, whoa, who is this? Like, who is this person? I guess as she's like kind of moved into that kind of larger spotlight, had your perspective of her shift like at all? Or you're like, no, this is the person that I watched back in California?
I think she's remarkably similar. Like she's not a different person by any means.
Yeah.
I think if anything, she's, smarter, older, wiser. Like hopefully we all are in the 20 years that we're doing something. But I do think that what has been surprising to me is kind of watching how she deals with failure specifically. And failure, you can call it whatever you want when she's running for president. But I mean, in 2021, she was having a really rough go of it.
Yeah.
It was
that was
kind
a
of
Lester Holt interview.
That was a Lester Holt interview that went really poorly. And, there were a lot of stories about how Biden should replace her on the ticket.
Yeah.
Essentially, because of all these things. And those stories were pretty persistent all up until, basically July of 2024. I think that how someone deals with failure is very instructive. And I think in her case, you've seen like a lot of I would assume introspection and sort of just rejiggering of all the things. And so, yeah, that's been interesting to see. I think also, Let me see. Yeah, I just, it's been really interesting to see her as sort of like the center of a universe of pretty powerful Black elected officials, Black women elected officials that she's created over the years that include like Latifah Simon and London Breed and mostly Californian politicians who, are not necessarily all super loved by progressives. In fact, some of them have very contentious relationships with progressives. And so I personally like to see that tension. I like it when it's made clear that not all Black people and not all Black women think the same. That's important to note.
We're all just human. We all have different thoughts and opinions.
Right?
Yeah.
We're all figuring it out. And really the question is like, can she manage an office?
Yeah.
Right. The most powerful office in the world, but can she manage an office?
Yeah.
And I think that is the question that we're grappling with right now.
Yeah. And so like the election is 24 days away from when we're filming this. And what do you think in these last couple of weeks, like the challenges and opportunities for her campaign?
At this rate, people are kind of set in their ways and set in what they think. So the question is will excitement about her candidacy reach people who were on the fence and maybe weren't going to vote, but now they're thinking about voting, right? And I that stand-up, I think, doesn't exist or hasn't really existed in the Democratic Party since like Obama. Mm-hmm. But I think it's also important to remember that, Obama wasn't the most beloved figure for progressives, in 2007, 2008. Another thing that I'll be watching, it's a little thing, but it's like she has been doing a media blitz.
Yeah.
And I'm
a big one.
A huge
this past week.
Which is, and it's not stellar, right? It's not, and nobody would be able to do a media blitz and have every single thing be like perfect.
Yeah.
But the fact that she's doing it, I think, is a huge change from 2021, Lester Holt going really poorly, and then her kind of disappearing from the public stage for a while. I'll be waiting for whatever the October surprise is. I mean, I don't know what it's going to be, but at this rate in this election year, it's going to be big.
Watching like how election coverage has changed since Obama and then with Trump and then now with Harris, how do you think about like election specific coverage and approaching it? Because it feels like the stakes are much higher now.
Yeah, it does feel like the stakes are higher. I think it's helpful to talk to politicians, but I think it's a great opportunity to talk to communities about what they want and what they're seeing. And I think giving more airtime to folks in communities is important. I think elections are an opportunity to, it's the performance evaluation of our leadership every 4 years, right? And we get to set the goals. We get to say, this is what we want. These are the merits that we're going to judge you on over the next 4 years. And so my hope is that more people can be part of that conversation or feel like they're part of that conversation, even if they're not excited about the candidate or candidates, right? I totally understand that. My hope is that they turn out to vote and are able to just at least be part of the conversation, because we're not looking to have a cheerleader in the White House. We're looking to have somebody that we want to hold accountable. Like, who would you rather fight with, right? Like, who would you rather kind of be battling against? And that's how I see it.
Well, seems like a great analogy for editor and staff and that collaboration we talked about earlier.
Definitely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we go, can you let our audience know where they could find you or your work?
Sure. Folks can find me on all the socials at Jamilah, JamilahKing, Jamilah King, and say hi.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, we'll link to everything in our show notes. And again, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, that's it for today's episode of The Rough Draft. To learn more about our guest and to find links and resources related to the conversation, check out rev.com/podcast. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to rate and subscribe in order to stay up to date with the latest episodes. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of The Rough Draft.